Well, welcome everyone to another workshop here at the Test Camp. This is Learning and Teaching for grades K6, 5-9, and 7-12. And we're about to discuss how learning and practicing test skills will empower your test confidence. Now, those of you who are joining us live online, you're welcome to contribute your comments anytime, and we'll try to get to as many as possible up here on the discussion boards. And if you join us directly through the Test Camp YouTube channel, well, welcome to you too. You're not here with us in person, but you have an advantage because you can pause or restart or replay that video anytime. Before we get started, and we're getting everybody kind of settled in here, note that this workshop is covering all three of those areas. We'll talk about that in just a moment, but it does not cover early childhood, which has different competencies. All right, there's a separate workshop for that. Now, here at the Test Camp, we provide training sites for teacher certification tests across the country. There's an example of Florida, where we're from. It's partnered with a company that brands this test that you see here. That's a different company than the test you're taking from. And many states require tests that might be branded differently, so you'll want to check that out. These are the tests that are listed in order here because that's generally how they're required. Is that how you did it? Right, you took the core first, then a content knowledge test. How many people here are not elementary ed? Okay, good. About half of us. That's all right. Good. All right, well, every state is different and the requirements might change. So that's up to you to make sure that you're doing the right thing, taking the right test at the right time. And you might find this interesting, how different states have different rules. Over there, the Florida Professional Education Test, which is similar to this learning and teaching test, applies to all grade levels. So down there in Florida, they just have to take one test. The learning and teaching test qualifies you at different grade levels. So again, make sure that you've checked with your administrators and especially at the school districts, and make sure that you have the test that's right for you. All right, this is just one example again of how tests might be different from state to state. All right, so during this workshop, we're going to discuss the competencies used by test writers to construct the learning and teaching tests. You can see down there that the learning and teaching tests, we said before, they're broken into three different areas. Let's go ahead and get started on that. All right, you likely know that around here our motto is to prepare, practice, and perform. And that's what makes us different. You have an opportunity here to practice, and then we can perform with confidence. And that's because taking a test is a performance. It requires more than just knowledge. A quality performance also requires skills. And in this case, test skills. That's where the confidence comes from, the work to learn and practice the test skills. Now, in this first step of training, you'll prepare by gaining knowledge about the test, again, through this workshop. You'll also gain knowledge about yourself through the activities, how well you know the content and the level of your test skills. Then, through the activities, you practice. You practice the testing skills, like how to identify the types of questions by the competence being tested. You'll learn in this workshop why that's important on all tests, but especially in learning and teaching. So there you go. You're going to practice the skills when you get over to the training site. And so finally, you're going to have the ability to perform your best. That's not even going to be a concern because you'll have earned the confidence during the test skills training. All right, so we start to prepare by studying the test format and content, which is provided in what's known as the test blueprint. As some of you I've talked to, you said you've already gone to these career workshops that we put out there for you. They're out there for free. You've seen them over in the training area. Well, you know that then the blueprint provides all the information you need really to fully understand a test. We're going to talk about that later. The test information guides put out by the state are excellent, and in your case, they're called study companions. Has anybody here already looked at the study companions? A couple of you have. Well, you'll want to look at that, and we'll talk about it in just a little bit. All right, and this can be a good first step also to creating what we call My Study Plan. And that just simply is a schedule that helps you to stay on track to review and study the test content that you think you need to do to get ready. This plan is going to guide you through the test skills training also, which is designed specifically for these tests. All right, a little more on that later in the workshop. Here's a table we're going to fill out here. It provides an overview of the question formats that you can expect to encounter on the learning and teaching tests. Multiple choice questions, sometimes called selected response, okay, they're just basically multiple choice, are generally in these three formats. The common format first is direct teaching. You're familiar with these. Here's an example. Okay, nothing here, right? nothing new. Okay, but let's see who's honest here. When you read this question, did you start up here at the top? How about, let's see some hands here. How many people want to be honest and say you start at the top? Or did you start down here at the bottom? How many people did that? Okay. Well, when you start with the answer set, that's what we recommend here at the test camp, and you'll get a lot more about that in the training and why that's important. But it really provides a preview to the question and can help you identify the competency before you even read the question at the top, what's called the STEM. So the second multiple choice format, you're familiar with this too, is called sentence completion, or fill in the blank, right? So with the blank generally is at the end of the sentence on these. It's nothing hard, there's nothing difficult about this. Now that you know the rules, you're going to be fine. Here's an example. You start down there at the bottom in the answer set, right? Okay. Another format used, the third one in multiple choice questions, is what's called a scenario. These are questions you might mark and save on the first pass through your test because these scenario questions, like it says up there, they require more time. And here's an example of one. You see how you have to read through all the possible answers there, choose teammates, work together, pick a project. This is taking too long to read through all these. You have about a minute per question generally, so these are ones you just pass through on the first time through, and again, you'll get that over there in the training. Again, scenarios like this require more time because you have to read through each one. So what we do is we recommend that you mark and save those, at least through the second time through the test. And that's a brief look at the three formats of the multiple choice questions, what they call selected response. Does anyone know how many multiple choice questions are on this test? Learning, yes, that's correct. There are 70 questions. And we're going to discuss budgeting your time for these questions in just a moment. In fact, you're going to talk about it there at the tables. The other section of the learning and teaching test is called constructed response. And just like you might assume from the title there, you can be expected to give some scenario, or actually two scenarios, and then two questions on each scenario. So you're going to have a total of 4 responses. So what percentage of the test score is based on the multiple choice questions, and what percentage is based on the constructed response? There you go. 75-25. Right, just 25% for those 2 long scenarios that you have to write, and you have to write out 4 answers to those. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Does anyone know the time allotted for taking the entire test? Yes, correct, 2 hours. Or we could say, I put up here already, 120 minutes. Okay? So at your tables, let's go ahead and have our first discussion here today about your approach to a test like this. How you're going to budget your time. You're going to start with a multiple choice and plow through those first, or are you going to start with the 2 scenarios, the constructed responses, and maybe just get those out of your way, or at least scan them first. And before we talk here at the tables, hang on, before you talk at the tables, any questions before we begin? You had one over here. Go ahead. I'll repeat your question for those watching the recording. Are the multiple choice questions mixed on the test? You mean mixed by the competency? Yes, they are. They're not separate subtests like you had in the core, right? You passed the core. There were separate subtests, so you got the reading, and then you got the writing, and then you got the math. That's not the case for teaching and learning tests. Good question. Any other questions? Over here. Yes, you can budget less time or more time for each section in any order. You can do it how you want, and you can skip back and forth to each section. Good question. All right, so go ahead and have a discussion at your table. What is your approach to this test going to be, and how are you going to budget your time? We'll come back as a group and we'll compare your ideas. Well, welcome to those of you joining us today live online. Share your thoughts, and we're going to include them in the discussion. And if you're joining us by the Test Camp YouTube channel, this might be a good time to pause that recording and consider what your approach might be. How much time do you think you're going to budget for each question? Are you going to skip back and forth? Compare your thoughts with our discussion when you restart the video. Okay, back up here. Those who have gone before, you have recommended the budget about 1 minute here. So let's continue this discussion. So about 1 minute per question up there for the multiple choice, and about 10 minutes per question for those constructed responses. So this is what that would look like. So that's kind of like what you had there at the tables. Pretty close, huh? And as you can see, this adds up to 110 minutes. So what they're suggesting is that you take the extra 10 minutes you might have and go back. You need to review the answers that you put in. So go back, review your answers, and then you should have plenty of time. It's not an issue for people running out of time on this test, by the way. It's an issue that they go through too quickly and make mistakes. Okay, any other questions then about the test format or budgeting your time? Yes, way back there, and I'll repeat the question. Yes, good question. We will talk about scoring and recommended studying resources later in the workshop. We sure will. Generally, you're looking, they do what's called a scaled score, but generally you're looking at about 70%, 72%. And here at the test camp, we require 80%. So that's why everybody who passes our programs always passes their tests. All right, let's discuss the test content. That was the format. Let's move on to the content. The questions, we'll talk about how they were constructed. And the first step is to talk about the types of questions, not the format of the questions. We're talking about identifying questions by their competencies, what the test makers used to build the questions. And a question often asked is, well, who decides? I mean, who are these test makers? Who decides what it means to be competent in each area? Any ideas about this? Who do you think? The experts today? So who are these experts? Who are they? Professors? Well, the test writers are teaching professionals. They come from school districts, they come from colleges, some do. They're recruited by the test company to construct test items. And it's not easy and it's expensive. The test items have to be valid, they have to be reliable. Do you know what those two terms mean? Right, and they have to represent what's called best practice, or what's currently going on today in schools. This is likely a term you've been learning about, right? If you're in a teacher education program, who's heard of this? Best practice. Yes, of course. Test questions also represent, and this is important, what's considered to be current educational culture. All right, so what does that mean? Well, we're going to talk about that mostly during this workshop. And for the next few minutes, we're going to explore exactly how this might influence the questions and the answers on this test. You know what the difference between objective and subjective, right? The objective test, 4 plus 7, probably going to be 11 most of the time. On this, little Johnny has a pencil he puts in his ear. What do? You know, that's a subjective, isn't it? There's no one set answer, but there is an answer that this test wants to hear that represents current educational culture. And you might not always agree with it for it, so that's not good. You're going to have to agree with the test. All right, well, we'll talk about that. The first competency is students as learners. There's 8 of these. Some of the key concepts include how students grow and develop in stages and how they learn best in each one of those stages. And we simply call this competency learning. And for a brief overview, what we do is we set you up with a couple of statements related to this. For example, the teacher should, statement A, let you read that there. And then here's statement B. Also makes a good point. In statement A, note that the student's interests are mentioned, as is the teacher's role, which is to guide. All right. In statement B, the teacher believes in the student's power of reasoning. Sounds okay. And they want to exercise that power. And the teacher's role is to encourage. How about that? They want them to study, but they want to study quality. So which way are you going to go on this one? Well, if you eliminated B, you're matching the current education culture and you're matching this test. Let's do another one of these. The second competency is students as diverse learners. Included are variables, the different types of exceptionalities you see there, legislation, that sort of thing. We simply call this competency diversity. There will be a quiz on this one that you can practice over in the training center. So again, let's look at a couple diverse statements. For example, when is the best time to encourage English language learners to practice their skills? In low-risk situations, where they're most likely to succeed, or with a learning buddy, which provides an opportunity to make mistakes, but just in front of their buddy. Is the teacher role to avoid putting the student down, make sure they avoid embarrassment, or to encourage growth, which will likely include learning from their mistakes? All right, what are you thinking? Cross out buddy. Right, you're starting to see a trend. I'm not here to tell you this. You need to try to see what these trends are because you need to recognize them when you get to the test. All right, the third competency shown here is mostly related to learning environment. All right, watch how the current educational environment is reflected in this pair of statements under our heading, environment. What might be considered appropriate or inappropriate? Creating an atmosphere that's inviting and non-threatening for the students, or rigorous, which is likely to reveal the student's strengths and weaknesses? Is it better to have students describe their teacher as one who's nurturing or their teacher as one who's challenging? All right, well, how would you like to be perceived as a teacher? All right, think about that, and does your perception match the current educational culture? The correct answer there would be A. Here's another example under environment. The teacher provides explicit directions so that the student does not feel anxious about what's expected. The students decide best how to approach each assignment. In the first scenario, the teacher is likely to provide directions in written form, on the board, as a handout, out loud, everything. In the second scenario, the teacher's role is to direct students to the resources so they can develop their learning skills. What do you think? All right, if you crossed out B, you're starting to align with the culture. All right, here's another pair. When discussing matters related to student progress, academic or social, okay, the teachers should communicate with the students privately, one-on-one, or talk about the whole class, what went on with the whole class. So environment scenario A suggests that everything should be kept confidential, teacher-student. B recognizes the value of a teachable moment. Might benefit the whole class. What do you think? Keep it confidential. Right? Remember the underpinnings of this competency? Right, what are you starting to recognize about the current trends in learning environment? Next pair. When a new student joins your class, you're expected to A, assign the students to a group. This is a new student. Okay, or introduce the student to the whole class and maybe have them tell a little bit about their background. Stand up and tell that. Okay. Goal of A, reduce possible anxiety for the student. Goal of B, to test their social skills. Determine their level of confidence in dealing with a new social situation. All right, is there any question about this one? Sink or swim, that's not recognized as best practice today. It's not a valid approach in the current educational culture. And speaking of culture, all cultures are to be shared and celebrated, or cultures are to be studied and compared. The learning environment's one of tolerance and acceptance. Or does having a diverse population of students provide a unique opportunity for learning and debating different perspectives? All right, so eliminate A. No, just kidding. It's B. Kumbaya. Everybody gets along. No debates. Right, exactly. No debates, no learning from different perspectives. Okay, and we're not getting cynical on this. This is just the way the test is kind of laid out. You really need to know what's going on. And you know what's going on in the schools. You've all been out there, especially if you've been in a government school, a public school. All right, let's move on to the fourth competency, instructional process. This is number 4 out of 8, right? And that includes compliance to state standards. You're also expected to know how to create learning units and have a working knowledge of the isms. You know what we mean by those? Constructivism, right? Traditionalism, especially the ones that might match the current educational culture. And we call this section planning. So how do you go about planning a lesson? You've been doing it. Most of you all been doing this for a little bit. If I was invited to drop in on your class, would your lesson most likely be described as criterion-based or design thinking? Do you know what these mean? Well, here you go. For criterion, that's like a top-down sometimes a project based, but usually top down. There's established goals, established standards. The teacher's role is to pose the problem, ask questions, and lead students to the predetermined, specific, and correct answers. Right? There's a one answer. When a problem is studied in the design thinking plan or indirect teaching, questions come from the bottom up. Most of the questions come from the students. There's no predetermined answers or conclusions. The teacher's role is to facilitate and encourage thinking. All right, so the pathways to learning, therefore, can be very broad. It's not narrowed down to one correct answer. All right, it's determined by the students. All right, so we're not going to move on. We're going to talk about this for a moment at your tables. When this test was built, not about what you believe, well, you can talk about that too, but when the test was built, several questions were based on this competency of planning, but only one perspective can be correct. So what are you thinking? Do you have a preference for either A or B? And what would be the correct response on this test? We'll come back as a group and compare your ideas with the test builders. For those of you joining us today live online, welcome again. Share your thoughts, and I'm going to include them up here on the discussion boards. And if you're joining us by the Test Camp YouTube channel, this might be a good time to pause the recording and think about this. So what are some of your thoughts about answering questions in a way that matches the test writers, that current educational culture, right? Then you can come and compare your thoughts to ours when you restart the video. All right, very good. Up here, had some interesting ideas about this competency and what might be considered the correct answer. Although many of us here expressed an interest in having students taking charge, and they thought that was a good idea, I think you are correct when you eliminate B down there. It just doesn't match what's going on out there today, the current educational culture, more and more government intervention. All right, so let's view another set of planning perspectives. Is your planning reflective of group effort and collaboration, or do you intend to foster individual effort and responsibility? Imagine what schools looked like back when I was in school. Did we all sit around tables, or did we have desks? Would you find evidence of cooperation in your plan, where students are encouraged to find the answers together? Or does your plan encourage competition? It allows the students to work independently and possibly even be ranked against each other among their peers. All right? The correct answer is, well, it's not individual effort or responsibility, and it certainly is not competition. That's one of those words, competition. If you see that one, generally that's one that you can eliminate. So has this been your experience recently in public education? Is this what's going on out there? It's reflective of current culture in schools and in homes in a lot of places. No losers, right? Everyone's a winner. Everybody gets a participation trophy, right? Who comes in second place? Yeah, the first loser. All right, let's try another pair. In this plan, you can expect to find the teacher models, the concept or the skill for the students. Okay, that's their job. And this is done so the students can follow instructions and be successful, generally on the first try, on their first attempt. Compare that perspective to this one. The students actually have to work to understand the concept or skill. The idea is they might fail on their first attempt or maybe even their second, but they're going to learn from failing, and they're going to take pride in the fact that they've overcome that and they've accomplished something. So the first plan is generally associated with direct instruction models. The teacher's in charge, does most of the talking. The second plan most closely related to indirect instruction. The students are in charge of their own learning and their own achievement. And the answer that most closely reflects current educational culture is, it's not B. In this next case, the teacher prepares a lesson plan that includes tips and tricks for learning. Mnemonics, songs and rhymes, that little contort your fingers to do the math thing. You know what I'm talking about? Yeah. Oh, two hands, okay. Especially for the low-level learners, they get a lot of this. In Plan B, the students aren't given the roadmap. They have to figure it out, usually on their own. So the idea of Plan A is to ensure student success, again, usually on the first attempt. In Plan B, there's some failure likely, especially on the first attempt. All right, any thoughts on the correct response? Not what you believe. Plan A, there you go. That's the correct response. You're doing great. And see how we put Plan A? We put that at the top for you there. I'm trying to ensure that you get them all right too. Okay, one more of these. Plan A. Make a plan that claims to encourage higher level thinking. That's kind of in vogue, isn't it? Or Plan B. Heavy doses of memorization and rote learning. Plan A. Full of references to the highest levels of Bloom's taxonomy. Plan B. Attend to the fundamentals before moving up that pyramid. All right, do you recognize the response that adheres mostly to today's current educational culture? All right. Do you see memorization and rote learning in your schools, at your tables? Take a few minutes, talk about this with your neighbors. Do you have a story about a lack of fundamentals with a student that you're working with? And what you're thinking about how you learned in schools and how students are encouraged to learn today. We'll come back as a group and compare your ideas with those of current education culture. Those of you joining us today live online, go ahead and share your thoughts again. That was very helpful in the last discussion section. And if you're joining us on demand, another good time to pause the recording and list some of your thoughts related to fundamentals and how you're going to answer these test questions when they say things like fundamentals or competition. All right, then you can compare your thoughts when we restart the video. We'll be here. All right, so we know your preference. Which answer would you eliminate? All right, over here, yeah. I'll repeat for the people listening in. So you think that fundamentals are important, but on this test, you would eliminate answers that hint of memorization or rote learning. Well, now that you have a plan, the next competency is, well, I think you're on the right track. Now that you have a plan, the next competency is related to instructional strategies. This competency represents what you do on your feet during instruction, right? What would you call this section? Yeah, we just call it teaching or strategies. There you go. You'll find that strategies is different than the previous competency, planning. This competency generally refers to teacher-student interaction. So this is the teacher's role. All right, so is the teacher role best described in terms of leadership? Is that how you picture yourself, as a leader or as one of guidance? That is, you're a worker who's called on to react to the needs of the students, or are you expected to promote personal responsibility in your students, guide them along the way as they get personally responsible? Now, both are good answers, but only one is more correct. It's kind of like when you're driving somewhere, you're driving somebody somewhere. What's more important, to get there safely or to get there on time? Both important, right? So think of that A up there maybe as safety. Maybe that'll help you along. So which is the most correct answer? Of course, it's the top. This perspective most closely aligns with current educational culture. All right, let's try another one. Understand each student and their background? Or do you need to have a deep understanding of the course content? If your administrator came in, is it better that they perceive you as learner-centered or student-centered? Or if they saw you as subject-centered? So if you think that knowing your students is regarded more highly than deeply understanding your subject matter, you're correct. On this test, you're correct. Okay, this next pair is related to your teaching approach. Do you start with the experiences of the learner and then show how that's related to the subject? Or do you start with the subject and then try and relate it to the learners, their experience? Okay, starting with the learner is called constructive or constructivism. Starting with the subject is sometimes called didactic. You heard of this word before? All right, let's compare the two before you make your decision on this, and you're going to talk about it again at your tables. You got a 6th grade science class, you're learning about marine biology. What are you going to do up there in A? You're going to start with the students, talk about their stories, their experiences. They went to some wildlife center, or down in Florida they went to SeaWorld or something like that. And B, right, study mammals. Then you go out. Once the concepts are mastered, then you go out. Maybe you plan a field trip like I did when we were in school. Then you plan a field trip, and then you apply everything you learned in class out there to that common experience. All right, so let's talk about this. Is there a right answer here? I think not, but talk about it. What are you thinking? Do you have a preference for A or B? And what would be the correct response on this test? We'll come back as a group, compare your ideas with the test builders. Those of you joining us online, please go ahead and put some more of your thoughts up there in the discussion boards. That's very helpful. And if you're joining us on demand, this might be a good time to pause the recording and list some of your thoughts about your role as a teacher. And then you can compare those when you return, when you restart the video. Okay, up here, everyone here who's over 30 years old, a few of us here, likely remember that you studied the fundamentals first, then you applied those to the concepts outside of the world, right? This would represent which response? That's correct, B, but B is not the preferred response on these types of tests. A is constructivism. Yes, and that's part of current educational culture, right? If you haven't heard the term constructivism before, you need to get familiar with that before taking the learning and teaching test. Got it backwards. All right, now here's an interesting pair. Does anybody recognize this situation? Okay. What should you do when you're giving praise to a student? This is the top is behaviorism, the bottom might be called humanism, more general rather than specific. All right, so should you have kids think for themselves? There you go. No, just kidding. The correct response on teaching and learning tests, dadgummit, I said it again, learning and teaching tests is up to the teacher. The adult is in charge. So a lot of behaviorism going on out there. All right, the sixth competency is assessment. And here's some of the concepts tested on this competency. Keep in mind your role as a teacher. Can you imagine what's more important, students that come up with the correct answers or students who come up with new ideas? Is the reason for having the assessments to determine that certain government-approved goals and objectives have been met? Or can at least some of the focus be on creativity? And again, let's not get too cynical. However, if you've had any difficulty with this pairing, I'm not sure you've experienced public schools lately. All right, think about how you're graded. Goals and objectives are king and queen. Right, and if you're currently in a college teacher education program, how many here? You're currently in the program here, right? A lot of us are, okay. Is most of the assessment, I mean, they can talk a good game, but most of the assessment, how do you make a grade here? Test scores. How about your ideas? Do you get credit for those? Do you get graded for those? Right, that's not how you're earning a grade. It's probably through test scores. Here's another pairing. How are you expected to measure student progress? Against standards or against other students? All right, that first one up there is called criterion reference. The assessments referenced are compared to certain criterion, certain standards, certain benchmarks. If you compare to peers, that's called norm reference. You're comparing to a sample group. So a group of students maybe at the same age level, for example. And both answers are appropriate, but in most cases, since goals and objectives are what's driving learning and teaching these days, expect A to be the most appropriate answer. Yes, go ahead back there. I'll repeat it for the people listening. Yeah, this is, we're about halfway through here, and the sample questions are all over in the training center. So we would be here 2 hours. I went through the sample questions like I do on a lot of the other ones. Good question. But yeah, they're over there. You'll be able to go through dozens and dozens of sample questions, and you'll be able to see the how this aligns. There, good question. Thank you very much. All right, so do you know the term for this type of assessment? Does anybody know what that is called? How about you reading people? How about this one down here? There you go. Okay, so you got them both. Formative's the top one, summative's down here at the bottom. Both appropriate, depends on the situation. But again, beware that there's a current emphasis on keeping daily or at least weekly records of student academic progress, and that means that you're more likely to encounter test questions related to formative assessment. As you monitor students' progress, you're going to be focused on what? Their errors, or you're going to focus on their ideas. All right. Is the emphasis diagnostic? So you're comparing students' condition, you're diagnosing them, right, against a set of standards, or what's called synoptic. It's basically a snapshot of the student's condition, where they happen to be at the time. No reference to where they should be at this grade level or anything, just where they are. And you might think about this in terms of a doctor's visit. Diagnostic, what's that mean? There is a problem. They're diagnosing because you probably came there because you need to be fixed. Synoptic just doesn't assume anything. It's just like getting your yearly physical. You simply get a report that provides a picture of your current condition. So how about public schools? If you were a school teacher like a doctor, what's your role? You are correct. Teachers have a responsibility beyond administering just a physical. They must also evaluate and assess the physical report and then act on it. Again, the assumption is there's always something wrong. There's something that needs to be fixed. How about that? If you're a doctor, you think that every patient is somehow sick before they come to you. Now you have to fix them. That's what's going on. All right, the 7th competency out of 8. From the test questions we have, that's called professional development. Here's some of the main concepts. And we call this competency just simply professionalism. Basically, this is how you're expected to improve as a teacher. And you likely haven't had a specific course that addresses professionalism, have you? You've had one called strategies or teaching strategies, yeah? Law or ethics, some of you. But you probably haven't had one that addresses this. This is weaved through your entire program. So let's look at a few of these. How would a professional teacher handle student conduct? Is it best monitored by a daily record? Or do you include student conduct as part of your course grades? Okay. Ongoing, anecdotal, formative, or put this in the grade book, summative. All right, you got it, correct. Student conduct and student achievement, those are two different things, are considered separate. Again, there is the issue of doing something now. So you couldn't wait around till the end of the semester, right? That's why formative is popular. All right, what if you need curriculum assistance? You're a teacher, professional teacher, you have a question about what's being taught. What's the professional move? To go to the school personnel, like other teachers, maybe your department chair, or do you take the initiative for yourself? You go out and study, or maybe you go back to school or you read. In other words, does the professional teacher in any situation lean on their local community first, or more generally the research community? Well, surprise, the answer is A. But you might not realize what the reason is. Again, it's about urgency. Remember the diagnosis analogy we just used. The assumption is something needs to be done now, so there's no time to go to school or consult research or take a course, anything like that. All right? So maybe that'll help you. The next pairing is related to professional teacher seeking instructional assistance. All right? Here's option A. First, look at your current practice and try to make improvements. Option B, consult your peers. Ask them to help you out. What's the best starting point? Reflective practice, start by monitoring your own behavior and making your own improvements. Or is the starting point professional consultation, seeking the advice of other professionals in your building? Any ideas on this? Yeah, go ahead, right over here. I'll repeat it for the people listening in. Yes, reflective practice, which always starts with yourself first. You've heard this in the class, right? Right. If you're in a teacher preparation program, you've likely heard the phrase reflective or reflective practice. How can you best monitor your improvement as a teacher in general? Do you monitor individual student test results every day? Or do you use the teacher gradebook to get an overview of your students' progress? For improvement in general, do you measure your overall performance day to day? Or do you stand back and take a summative view? And I'll give you a hint. The answer might be deceiving. So think about it this way. If you want an overall view of your health, say body weight or something, it's a good idea to get on the scales every day or about once a week or so. See what I'm saying? Sometimes you can do it too much. So there is a danger, believe it or not, even for professionals, of measuring too often, getting false readings or taking up all your time doing assessments. So for general improvement, you might lean more toward a summative review. All right, so let's look at one more scenario for this competency. Parent involvement. What does a professional teacher do? They contact the parents through the students or make contact directly with the parents. The first strategy suggests that students know the culture of their household, therefore they make good couriers of the information. The second strategy suggests that contact directly with parents is most effective and more efficient, and it leads to more open communication. So which way are you thinking here? The preferred response is the triad of teacher, then parent, then student. That has been changed over time, right? So it's not B anymore. It's not that triad. Yeah, well, I know it might fly against what you think you know, but I'm just telling you. Here we go. You're about to take a test. So watch out for these when you're in the training center. There'll be several questions like this and you can get on the right track. Last competency, final competency, education, law, and ethics. Okay? All right, there's relatively few test questions built on this competency. We just simply call this ethics generally. Here's a few of the things you might need to know about that. Let's try a couple of these. Pair of statements related to ethics. Here, start this one with student injury. Or even if you see someone who you perceived a student has an injury. Response A, inform the local officials in your school or your school administration. So let me say that again because I said that wrong. Up there with A, you should inform the local government. So these are people, officials outside the school. B is those people inside the school. I'm starting to give away the answer. A, there you go. Department of Child and Families is what they call it down in Florida. B, the people in the school. All right, so common sense would kind of say B here, wouldn't it? But she's right over here. Go with A. Right. And we can talk about that after workshop. We don't have that much time here, and you'll see that in the training center too. Why that's going on nowadays. Okay? This is maybe an area you want to study if you haven't had a law class. Here's another situation. What are the implications of law and ethics related to technology? Are you bound to follow licensure agreements or to consult a local personnel when you have an issue? You don't understand what the laws are. You abide by government law or by the local practices maybe in your district. And the correct response is know the law. Yeah, in terms of using technology, including software, you need to know the law. And there's often workshops for this in your district that will tell you about that. Maybe you can gain some continuing ed points by taking those workshops. And what about email? What are some of the hazards to be aware of? Well, the main concern about opening a message would be potential viruses, or is the legal and ethical concern related to non-academic or fraudulent information? More specifically, is the main concern that you might do something that's harmful to the system or harmful to yourself as the user? Your first responsibility is to the school district, so to protect the system. Okay, so let's review what we learned here today. Take a minute at your seat. See if you can list the 8 competencies. Maybe you can even do them in order. I see you've been writing these down. Then check with your colleagues to see if you have the same list. Talk about this. Is it valuable now that you know what the test questions are going to be built on? And we'll come back and talk more about the blueprint in just a couple of minutes. Hey, welcome again to those of you joining us. This is probably our last break, I believe. If you've joined us live online, go ahead and share and we'll put those up on the discussion. Hey, if you're joining us on demand, this is a good time to go ahead and stop and maybe test yourself. Do you know the 8 competencies, and how important is that to know these competencies in order when you go to take the test? And we'll be here when you restart the video. Okay, we're back. We need to get moving here. Everybody has their list. So as we go through the competencies, I'm going to point some percentages out for you here. Here's the first competency. There's all 8 of them. All right, here we go. The first one was learning. That's right. That makes sense, right? Because in the current educational culture, you begin with the student. So questions based on this competency, about 10% of them. There's 70 questions, so about 7 to 8 questions on learning. Then we move on to diversity. Expect again about 10% of the questions, so about 7 or 8 questions about diversity. And then we move on to environment. Okay, consider how students are supposed to be treated. Picture that nurturing environment that's going to motivate students to want to learn. About 7 questions there. Okay, now that you've done all that, it's time to turn your attention to teaching. So it starts with planning, and it's the first of 2 competencies that address what they call the instructional process. So you can expect about 10 questions here. And now that you understand planning, you move on to the teaching strategies. Again, another 10 questions or so. Now what do you have to do? You plan the lesson, you taught it. What's the big deal out there in government schools? Assessment. Right, so you have to make sure that you have assessed the whatever it was you planned, okay? And there's about 15 questions were built on this competency. All right, does that make an impact on where you might review or study? There's more of those questions, maybe you study those more. All right, finally on to professionalism, that's 7 questions there. Law and ethics, also 7 questions. So you can see here at the test camp, what we do is we set you up with quizzes for each one of the competencies, and all the questions and answers are randomized. And again, on the learning and teaching test, the questions are all combined on the one test like was asked earlier, but this helps you study. All right, so remember too that the multiple choice section accounts for just 75% of the total test score. The 4 constructed responses based on 2 scenarios, well, they're represented this way. Okay, those professional readers are going to use a rubric to assign scores, either 2, 1, or 0, based on the test skills you see here. And there's a lot more. You can practice this over in the Training Center. More specifics about this section are found in the test information guide we're going to look at in just a moment. That's called the Study Companion and produced by the Test Company. It's terrific. All right.